Good morning, everyone. A very warm welcome to Digital Catapult. Thank you very much for turning out on this cheery morning. Thank you for making the effort to come. My name is Jeremy Silver. I'm the CEO here at Digital Catapult. I just wanted to take 2 minutes to tell you a little bit about the work that goes on at Digital Catapult, because although I'm sure you all know lots about CoSTAR and are going to know even more by the end of the morning, you may not know sort of why it's here and what else we do. So just a few, if you forgive me, I think probably looking around, there's a few of you who know what we're about, but there may be a larger number who don't. So Digital Catapult is part of a network of catapults. There are 9 catapults across the UK, most of which are very specific in what they do. So there is an offshore renewable energy catapult, and there is a cell and gene therapy catapult. And they are very narrowly focused on their objectives. And we, for our sins, are digital, which, as you will appreciate, means everything to everyone and nothing to everyone, which therefore means that we have a sort of a choice about how we go about things. But the fundamental purpose of all the catapults, and this is sort of in a way what we take as our sort of guiding mission, is to benefit and drive advantage into UK businesses by encouraging the adoption of technology. And in our case, we're really interested in driving the very early adoption of advanced digital technologies in such a way that companies gain a competitive advantage, that they gain global edge, and that they grow and they contribute to the economy in the process. And so for us, that also means that we're very involved in what I think is broadly kind of recognized now as kind of a green digital transition. That in the process of digitizing processes and of making your systems and ways of working more digital, for the most part, and there are some exceptions, but for the most part, that does drive sustainability, that does reduce waste, that does decrease people's carbon emissions. And to that extent, we're very, very focused on achieving that. And so when we look across the whole kind of range of digital technologies, we've developed a bunch of expertise in some of the more advanced areas. So we have deep technology expertise and substantial teams in 5G, for example, or in the Internet of Things, in artificial intelligence, machine learning, in blockchain, and all of those areas are areas which are susceptible to the Gartner hype cycle. So a lot of the time we're spending trying to figure out, okay, what's real here and what's the hype? And I think that is possibly one of the themes that may emerge during the course of the conversations this morning as well. So we've, for quite a long time, we drove our kind of focus through individual technology areas. More recently, we've realized, and I think it's fairly obvious, I suppose, but it's taken us a while to get to this recognition, that actually it's the combination of technologies working together that has the biggest impact. And so we've kind of re-envisaged the kind of the shape of the stack that we work in and have developed kind of 3 broad application areas that we work in, of which the first is the deep infrastructure, digital infrastructure, advanced digital infrastructure. We're currently working on about £30 million worth of projects for DCMS that are in that space over the next couple of years. And some of you may notice the back part of this building or this floor is blocked off at the moment because there's a big new telecoms lab being built there. We're also working, the second of the application areas is the digital supply chains. And we started thinking about that and developing that 2 or 3 years ago. And in the course of the last couple of years, it's become obvious that supply chains are incredibly important and surprisingly vulnerable, I think is probably what we've discovered. And so we're working again in combination between academia and industry, funded by Innovate UK, on a £25 million digital supply chain innovation hub, 10 million of which is from Innovate UK and 15 of which comes from industry. And really interesting, really exciting stuff coming from that. And then the third and final application area is the one that's probably most relevant to this morning's conversations, is what we broadly term virtualization. And this is really recognizing the degree to which at the top end of the stack, if you like, the interface and the visualization, virtualization has become such an enormous area. And it ranges from the kind of industrial side of things where we talk about digital twins through to the kind of cultural and entertainment side where some people use the M word, and we all know what that means, don't we? Or perhaps we don't, but then that's what we'll find out during the course of today. So we're super excited to be hosting this morning. a couple of my colleagues are around. There's Madalena and Jesse and David. Stick your hands up and wave your hands around. If you want to know anything more about what the Catapult does, then they're here, so do ask them. I think I won't say anything much more than that. I suppose one other thing I should just say is that of all the Catapults, we're the only one that focuses on the creative industries. That has been our focus since the Catapult was founded, and we've continued to develop that. And we've developed it really through a focus largely on immersive content. Back in 2016, we kind of took a view that there were exciting new contents and formats emerging from the developments and the capabilities around virtual reality and augmented reality. I think we've taken a slightly different view of that a few years on, but we did a huge amount of work to explore and develop new kinds of formats in that way. And some of you may remember the Creative XR program that we ran over 3 years with the Arts Council, which funded about 60 different prototypes exploring different kinds of mixed reality content experiences. Quite a few of which have gone on to either be available on the Meta download store or to have won prizes at various shows around the world like Venice and Tribeca and so on, which you may or may not regard as being meaningful and successful. Great as those things are, they don't necessarily mean that a market has emerged. And I think the moment that we're in now, and in a sense that the excitement around CoSTAR I think is testimony to it, is that we're sort of at a watershed moment where a lot of those early experiments have kind of transmuted into what we now broadly talk about as virtual production. That we've sort of stepped back into the present from the future, reversing our optimism and putting it into the present. And now, I suppose, with the conversations that are bubbling up around whatever version of the M word you want to use, see, I don't want to even say it, that there is a sort of a real interest in what kinds of new business models might emerge, what kinds of new capabilities. But we're going to get into much more of that, and lots of far more expert people than I am are going to talk about that this morning. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for coming, and have a very good day. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeremy. Very perceptive. Lots of things that Jeremy mentioned will come up, I think, in the things that will through the briefing on the CoSTAR competition. And in the discussion. It's also really appropriate. It's great for us. We've been going around doing a series of these events briefing about CoSTAR. It's great to do the final one here at the Catapult, because in many ways, the ideas that have, over a period of time, become CoSTAR started here in discussions with the Catapult around what one might do at scale around underpinning virtualization of production technologies. So it's great to kind of come through that circle from where those discussions started. So now, excellent. Right, so this is what we're going to do. I'm going to talk for a little bit about the rationale for CoSTAR, what it is, why we're doing it now, what's the opportunity. Then my colleague Laura Partridge is going to brief on the competition. So lots of you, I'm sure, have read all the competition documentation and will have lots of questions, but it's what Laura will be trying to do is try and draw out of that pages and pages of verbiage that you have to write around these things, the key bits that we're thinking about and what we want from you if you're thinking of applying for this money. Then we'll do some Q&A on that, and then I think we might have a little break, is that right, for a coffee? And then we'll have a panel, and what a panel it is. So Rishi Kupan from BFI, Sue Lister from ILM, and Jeremy himself returning to the stage. So the idea there is not so much that they are not accountable for any questions about CoSTAR. They don't, the idea is to open out the discussion and get three kind of expert kind of views of what CoSTAR might contribute. So that's where we are. CoSTAR team, so there's three of us. My colleague Laura is here and identifiable as such from that photograph. Our colleague Hannah Farag, I think, is online, our head of impact and delivery, but can't join us here today. So that's the team. And for some of you will know from Audience of the Future that Laura and Hannah were key parts of the Audience of the Future team that have now moved from Innovate UK to AHRC to deliver CoSTAR. So a word from our sponsors. Look at that. That's a £7 million a year operation. So UKRI, this is UKRI infrastructure funding. this is an AHRC, Arts and Humanities Research Council project, drawing on those funds. And it's the first time that those kind of funds have been used for a creative industries project. But infrastructure funding, as you might expect from the name, has certain attributes. There are certain things you can spend money on, certain things you can't spend money on, and we'll cover that through the briefing. So, rationale for CoSTAR. What are we talking about? Well, Jeremy gives a rather brilliant introduction to this. I'm trying to sell everybody on this phrase, advanced media production, because I think the manufacturing folk did a really clever thing when they talked about advanced manufacturing. It's just manufacturing, but it's kind of new. And I think we might do well to do the same. But what is it? Well, there is a stack of technology that is transforming the way we make things. Now, at the moment, certainly in the film sector, this tends to be referred to as virtual production. But that's just one model. It's what we can see now. It's incredibly powerful and it's moved forward incredibly quickly. But today's virtual production is not the end of the line for this. And I was going to say, you can see the metaverse from here, but actually you can't quite see it over there, so through St. Pancras. So it's a question not only of providing an infrastructure for the current instantiation of this technology stack, but for the future as well. The UK is obviously globally competitive in this at the moment, and what CoSTAR is trying to do is to make sure there's an R&D runway to underpin future investment. We also tend to use the term creative R&D, and this is something that we've talked about through the clusters program, which UKRI supported, AHRC supported, and through Audience of the Future, the Innovate UK program. And the key thing about creative R&D, and this is particularly, I think, relevant for the universities in the room, is that it's fundamental that this is applied research for the creative industries. This is not research about the creative industries. This isn't blue skies research. It's about creating future value in the creative industries. And what we've seen from the clusters program particularly is that partnerships between universities and industry can deliver impacts and capture that value at scale. And it is, of course, about infrastructure. Well, to date, we've had 2 large creative industries R&D programs which have invested in projects. This is different. This is about investing in infrastructure. And we're even starting to think about this as evergreen infrastructure. So this isn't, although what we are talking about today is an initial 6-year funding program to set up a series of facilities, a series of labs. What we're talking about is an ongoing support for those labs through a thing called world-class labs, which normally is the kind of funding that supports big physics experiments, digging holes in mountains and putting telescopes in them, and that kind of thing. So this is a first for the creative industries. So we have a model that at the end of this funding, things roll off onto a recurrent model. And that enables us to do the essential things, which is start thinking about future technology ways as well as the solutions of today. So why? Again, Jeremy mentioned this. In fact, you covered a lot in that intro of the background. There does seem to us, why do it now? There does seem to us a practical, not theoretical convergence going on between a stack of these technologies. Variously, you might think of them as XR technologies or real-time or visualization, or all those performance and motion capture technologies. But it's not just about the technologies. I think across screen and performance, there is a coherence there. But it's also a convergence on roles and skills. So we're seeing people move between live performance, whether that be musical, theatrical, working on movies, working on games. And there are new roles that are necessitated by this combination of technologies that are already there, and in which there's probably a deficit. Skills is a particular challenge for this funding. I'll talk about that a bit later on. And so this is all happening before we've got the full application of AI and particularly machine learning around that, which will change the level of accessibility, ease of use, and cost base for this. We're talking about screen and performance. The reason we've said that, and this largely comes from my experience with Audience of the Future, is it seems that there is a coherent stack of these technologies that extends across screen, by which of course I include games as well as film and TV, but also into live performance and other performance media. It seems coherent to us now, and that isn't quite so true of the other areas of the creative industries beyond that. They're core UK strengths, but we also think that by focusing on screen and performance, we can bring in those other areas of creative industries which can utilize these technologies and are starting to, but aren't at the same stage of development. Fashion being an obvious one, but advertising, marketing, communications being another. And we obviously see there's a potential here for UK growth in the creative industries. Some of that growth will come through the evolution of the technologies to become more democratic, more easily accessible and cheaper. So taking this from what is, to be honest, bleeding expensive into a kind of more accessible market used by more productions, more companies. We also think that if we can get this right with these labs, it'll help support and define niches for new companies, particularly working in the creative technology space, which will drag in private sector investment. So it's important that we think of this as an innovation infrastructure rather than a research one. Now, I mentioned before, the UK is preeminent in this. This is some data that just shows where we sit at the top end of this, that was done, put together by the Department for International Trade earlier in the year. As Jeremy says, there may be some bumps and cuts and bruises from where we are at the moment as this rolls out. But at that point, DIT could identify that in the terms of the kind of new factories of very, very high-end media production volume stages or virtual stages. There were 12 tier 1 stages in the UK, 10 of them in London and the South East, actually even around the M25 in many ways, which compared at that point in March and by those definitions, so there's obviously a few asterisks here, to only 9 of similar stages in the US, and only 4 around Los Angeles. And then by comparison with the rest of the world, 3 in Canada, 2 in Germany, possibly only 1 in Germany since this slide was made. I'm not quite sure how Babelsberg is faring at the moment, 1 in Australia and 1 in Japan. So what's happened here is, for a variety of reasons, in terms of the application of this new technology stack, the UK is in a remarkable position. Now, the variety of reasons includes the traditional strengths of UK film sector in terms of skills, the presence of major production houses and studios in the UK, really fantastic set of tax breaks, as well as the pandemic, which I think changed the economic balance, the kind of business case for using these technologies. But it shows at the moment that this is something that at the high-end application in current production, the UK is right at the forefront. So that's one part of why now. But there's also, I think, post-COVID, as I say, the pandemic, and we saw this not just at the high end, but in performance technologies, theatrical technologies. When the theatres were closed, COVID drove the adoption of a series of virtualization technologies, and it tipped the scale in the business case. Now, as Jeremy mentioned, so we're somewhere on the hype curve. I think probably everybody's got, maybe we should have a pin the tail on the donkey, pin the tail on the hype curve session, where exactly people think we are. But some of this post-COVID acceleration is not going to go away, and it will continue. Similarly, we've got at the moment a wave of investment in production facilities in the UK, which has a momentum that will continue for several years, whatever happens to individual ones of those investments. What we're trying to do is almost accompany that with an R&D infrastructure, an R&D investment, so that continues not just to build sheds for conventional filmmaking, but rolls out and can rely on an R&D base. So it underpins the case for the UK as a place to do innovation as well as production. And most of what we've talked about there, and most of what's captured in the term virtual production, is talking about using this stack of technologies to create conventional linear screen outputs. But that isn't the whole story. We know that whatever version of metaverse you believe in, even if it's the original kind of Neil Stephenson vision, if the internet's to evolve into a set of connected spaces and experiences, and in which the entertainment or screen and performance vectors are going to contribute, then these technologies are going to be at the heart of that. So we need to think about future capabilities, not just the current model refining and refining. And so we think, and this is fundamental to the case for CoSTAR and how it's structured, what we're asking for, is we need an infrastructure that can think about R&D and solutions in the near term and in the long term. And by long term, I don't mean very long term, I mean 3 to 5 years out, that the next wave. So we've called it, and we persuaded Bayes to give us the money on the basis it was an innovation infrastructure, not a research infrastructure. Now, that might seem a subtle distinction, but I think what it's really about is the difference is we want this infrastructure to support the growth of companies. So this is not research for research sake. It's growing companies and enabling the creation of new companies. It's about exploiting IP, commercializing the processes, the workflows that come out of this. So no illusions for those thinking of applying for this funding, that innovation-led business growth is part of what we see this infrastructure doing. If you have read the documentation, I really apologize for the appallingly long sentence that tries to accommodate all our delivery objectives in one thing. So just to break it down a bit and kind of re-emphasize the points. So we're trying to underpin the long-term competitiveness of the screen and performance sectors. This is what we're trying to do. This is how we're trying to do it. It's how we want you to do it, providing a highly capable R&D infrastructure that allows those people, researchers, companies and institutions, access to these facilities, capabilities and insight. And Laura will touch very briefly on what we mean by insights, which is going to be a future call. And what we're trying to do is ensure they can do world-class R&D, of course, as I've said, in current and future waves of technology. And what we're talking about is transforming the means of production. We can already see that happening at the high end. We want to support the rollout of that transformation of how we make things across the sectors. We think to do that, you're going to need a partnership. You can't do this on, nobody's well placed to do this on their own. So at the heart of that has to be a research organization. So conventionally, you think of a university, but it could also be a research technology organization, a Catapult, an RTO, or an IRO, an independent research organization. The reason these have to be at the heart of it, apart from their skills, brilliance that they bring to it, is because these are the people that the AHRC can fund for the purposes of infrastructure. So they're crucial to the partnerships, but they mustn't be on their own. You need industry in there. We've said, and however many times I'm asked the question, I'm still going to say we have said that we want these facilities co-sited with industry, not cited on university campuses. So you need that exchange. You need industry partners who are in this for the long term. It's an infrastructure that's critical to the business case. We think most people will benefit from, but everybody needs the support of local regional economic development agencies. Now, the problem with the UK is it's very hard to describe those, and they could be local authorities, they could be economic development agencies, they could be other types of agencies in the nations. There's a whole set of other institutional partners. But why we think you'll need this is infrastructure, and these people will want to help locate that infrastructure on their patch. And they'll also be long-term partners who can amplify the R&D impacts. And then you've got to tell us, because you've got to know who your users are. So which companies, which organizations will want to use these facilities that you're bidding to provide. Say something about co-investment. So you'll see in the business case, there is a minimum co-investment number. It is a minimum. So it's set for lot 2, around 4.5 million against the 12.5 million of grant. For lot 1, it's a little more demanding at 15, nearly 16 million against 51 million of grant. They may seem quite big numbers for some who are perhaps relatively new to this game, but we're relying on what we achieved through the Industrial Strategy Challenge from programs. And the interesting thing there was that we learned that concentrating on in the old-fashioned way on initial co-investment, so going and saying you bid for the money and you must have letters of support that shows that your industry partners will contribute a certain amount of money. We found that's both ineffective and misses what you can deliver through the success of these organizations. So these kind of structures. So what we're talking about is a minimal initial level of investment. We will be counting that in rather more rigorously than perhaps research councils have done in the past, where a promise from a major company of a certain amount of money was enough. We will actually be counting it. But then what we found, and the histogram on the right is what we found with the clusters program. If we just maintained our target at that initial investment, that's the dark blue bars. Over time, the partners, as they perceived these things to work, contributed the light blue bars, which was additional investment. If we'd asked them to contribute that at the start, they wouldn't have felt confident. But as the clusters developed into action, the clusters also found they could raise aligned co-investment. So that's not co-investment for the R&D, but co-investment aligned with the objectives, perhaps in a geography. So that was particularly true of skills funding, and then follow-on investment. So when things worked, this is largely private capital going into exploiting the things that work. So if we'd stuck with clusters at our initial investment, I think we would have ended up with around £32 million. In fact, the clusters over the 5 years, the 5 years that they've had, have raised over £200 million. So we're asking for something very specific at this stage, which is your initial co-investment from your partners. Now, because it's an infrastructure, that may include matching capex, land, all sorts of things. What we'd like to hear about is how you think that can grow over time on this kind of model. So what we've asked for is very much a minimum. So anybody thinking of ducking under it, please don't, because it is part of the assessment. Just very briefly, governance, management, sustainability. So there's a really complicated diagram in there about how we think this thing will operate from the start. It's not really that complicated. Basically, you've got the 4 labs at the bottom, or up to 4 labs, because we're saying up to 3 network labs, and what will be the data insight and foresight unit. What we're trying to create is a structure that governs appropriately the public money within this, but allows the people who are delivering the infrastructure and their partners to manage and operate it and be more imaginative. So there'll be a kind of board that sits there that brings everybody who's delivering it together without participation from the funder. So you can have all your arguments in private without the funder looking over your shoulder, and we'll account for the money in the appropriate way through the AHRC. But it's also a way of thinking how this thing might evolve, how it might develop, not just a funding stream from the UKRI Infrastructure Fund, but industrial funding streams, other research funding streams, to develop a mixed model so that by the end of this setup phase, it can grow in the directions that seem useful to business, the research partners across the piece. And maybe its own structure will evolve as well. I'm often asked this one, where? And the answer to that is, we don't know. We don't have a fixed view of where this is and the different nodes of it are. We are trying to create a network infrastructure, obviously, by having several components to it. There are 2 things that are in our minds, however. We are very mindful of the uneven distribution of the UK creative industries. You know, grab the UK by the top of Scotland and shake it. A lot of the creative industries fall to the bottom. So we're mindful of that and mindful what infrastructure could do to change that. But we are commissioning a national infrastructure. This is not purely a levelling up play. We're commissioning a national infrastructure, and everybody should think about that. So wherever they're thinking of placing the nodes in this infrastructure, you've got to make it nationally accessible as well as accessible to a particular region. So you have to think about your user groups and how they might work in this lab, what you might need to do to enable them to bring projects over a period of weeks, but more probably months, to the lab. So this is what we want to know: how you can contribute to this network, what long-term impacts you can deliver locally, but also nationally, and how this might support or build clusters of activity, either the ones that already exist or new ones. So that's me nearly finished for this bit. You'll be glad to hear. There's one thing, however, I have a request. Obviously, there have been various attempts to assess where we are on this journey around the virtualization of production, and particularly where we are around this in terms of research facilities or R&D facilities. My colleagues at CRAC at Loughborough University, so Graham Hitchens over there, happy to talk about this to anybody. Give us a wave, reluctant wave there from Graham. And our colleagues at Bot Consulting are trying to do a landscape survey as a snapshot at this moment, create a kind of baseline for us. In our, whenever you do one of these big programs, actually getting the evaluation started and your baseline ends up being kind of a couple of years after it started by the time it's done. But we want to take a snapshot, if we can, of late 2022. This is not part of the CoSTAR assessment. It's not that if you don't fill in this form or answer this questionnaire, you'll be in any way judged. It's not. No, it really isn't. Honestly, it isn't. But it would be enormously helpful, because what we want to do is to try and get data back to you before you're putting your bids in. So you can have access to a snapshot of what we think is going on nationally. So it's really there to help you. So it would be great if you could contribute, and that's whether you apply or not, because you may be involved in this and have something very relevant to say. So that's it. That's it. That's kind of some of the rationale. It seems to get kind of more expansive every time we do this. But now Laura's going to take you through the rules and regulations of the competition, because there are some things in here that are unfamiliar and new.
Hello, everyone. Right, so hopefully what Andrew's done expertly there is set the context and the scene and why we're doing this. And I'm going to take you through the how, assuming there are lots of people in the room with intent to apply. This is how we do it. So the current funding call is for what we're calling lots 1 and lot 2. So the national lab, and as Andrew said, up to 3 network labs. There will be a later funding call, likely early in the new year, to cover lot 3, which is for a data and insight and foresight unit. But we're not going to unpack that today. We're just going to focus on lots 1 and 2, the national and network labs. So with the national lab, over £50 million of the grant, with that minimum co-investment target of 15.7 million. We would expect the national lab capabilities to have a very strong applied research focus, and therefore probably focus on technology readiness levels 3 to 6, co-sited with industry, not with HEI and on a university campus. And what the national lab will do on behalf of the entire CoSTAR network is deliver a programme of pilots, demonstrators, enterprise commercialisation, knowledge exchange. So with the National Lab, our expectations are that this would probably be a new build. And as we've talked about already today, there must be that local economic development partner, delete acronym as applied to whichever geography you're in the UK. And the National Lab obviously plays a huge role at becoming sort of the beating heart of a future cluster, seeding that long-term development. So have that real focus on the long view. The network labs, £12.5 million of the grant, up to 3 labs, as we've said, and looking at those higher TRL levels. So much more near to market ready innovation. And again, co-sited with industry, not universities or HEIs. Slightly different from the National Lab, our expectations are that the network labs would probably be upgrades, extensions, refits of existing facilities. And again, those other conditions still apply. So there must be that local economic development agenda embedded in the plans and partnered. And they will play a huge role as becoming, again, that heart of future development for the long term. And whilst the National Lab will deliver those aforementioned programmes, the network labs will sort of inform and reflect that process and propose and contribute to the programmes that the overarching CoSTAR network goes on to deliver. Rules. Okay, eligibility. Andrew covered this, but just to reiterate, the lead bidder must be that RO, RTO, or IRO. Everyone loves an acronym, right? So those academics in the room will be familiar with JES and all of its loveliness. So those lead bidders who are actually putting together the bid must be those research organisations. Partnership is a massive word in CoSTAR, and we're going to keep using it. But your bid needs to include a minimum of one industry partner and one local economic development partner. You can have up to a maximum of 5 core partners. So your others could be a mixture of additional industry businesses or additional research organisations. And this should go without saying, but the lead bidder obviously needs to have that right up to the top level institutional backing from the head of their respective organisation. In terms of bidding, if you are leading on a bid, you can lead on one bid for the National Lab, and you can lead up to 1, 2, or all 3 of the bids for a network lab, but no one organisation will be allowed to operate both. This is, by the way, is all in much more detail in the documentation, so we're hopefully not saying anything here that you haven't already read with a fine-tooth comb already, but these are kind of standout details, and we'll cover as we go through a bit more of detail. If you are partnering on a bid, you can partner on 2 bids for the National Lab and up to 3 bids for network labs as well. Hopefully everyone realises that the call opened some time ago now, so opened on the 11th of October. That deadline, it closes at 4 p.m, not just on the 2nd of February, but at 4 p.m. That might get mentioned again. It's very important, tattoo it into your diaries. So we will go after the deadline straight into the assessment period in the spring of next year. And we will be aiming to announce preferred bidders by the end of March. We then move into Treasury full business case preparation and pre-award prep, which will take us from spring into the summer with a view to awarding the grants in August. So that's for 6 years. But again, that's the 6 years of the funding to produce the physical infrastructure. But what you are thinking about goes beyond those 6 years. It's what you're seeding with the infrastructure, not so much what it is at that point, but also what it does. Criteria and weighting of the assessment, really important. Hopefully it's not a surprise that vision and strategic fit has got the highest weighting of assessment at 30%. What we're really asking here is, can you do this? What is your grand plan? How can you articulate that? What's the vision? Deliverability, value for money, 25%, also quite a high weighting. We're kind of asking that same question again there. Can you actually do it? How competitive is that idea? How feasible is it? Is it robust? Is it credible? Is it viable? And with equal weighting at another 25% is looking into the bigger picture. How is your vision contributing to the broader UK creative industries as a sector? What's that impact, not just locally, but regionally and nationally? And where is your value added? And inside of that, that includes the co-investment. What is that you are going to bring in to contribute to that bigger picture? And then at 10% each, how will your idea for CoSTAR contribute to environmental sustainability? How will you articulate that through your application? And again, 10% on contribution to equality, diversity and inclusion across the sector. Obviously, a big driver for the creative industries. I've mentioned lovely JES, here it is again. So applications all through JES and the costs are 100% FBC. Going to say it, there are a lot of attachments needed for this application, but hopefully you'll see from the bullet list here in the deck that each one really speaks to the previous assessment criteria. So we've designed that in such a way that it's hopefully made easy to really reiterate and articulate how each aspect of your why and your how and your who and when can speak to all of those criteria really neatly. Just a little word on the core partner statements. We've had a lot of questions around these. They're definitely much more than those kind of standard copied and paste letters of support. They've got to be speak really closely to that vision so that it all hangs together really, really well. And that part, again, keyword partnership is really embedded and apparent in your applications. And then risk registers and targets, pretty standard stuff, but give time to those different sections. They're all really important. And without those attachments, we can't see how you're applying to the vision of CoSTAR. So just to nearly end on a couple of just reiterated things. I might have mentioned the deadline. It's there again. It's 4 o'clock on the 2nd of February. It's non-negotiable. It will not move. That is the deadline. It's there on the slide deck. Co-investment, Andrew did a great job with that particular slide, articulating this one. So think about that. It is part of the assessment criteria. Think about where you might be on co-investment in the early stages and how that might develop and evolve to the duration and the life cycle of CoSTAR. And finally, something on communications. So I can see a lot of people have been taking photos of the slides, which is great, but this deck is online already. So if you scroll right down to the end of the funding information page, there's a section on additional information, and we've published this deck there. So you've got that to go back and reference. And we'll share anything that comes out of it after this specific event as well through direct emails. As you know, this is the 6th of 6 similar briefing events that we've done all the way around the country. So yeah, the grand finale. Up until now, I've been able to say that other events are available, but this is us. This is a big one, and obviously we're streaming this live as well. It's got quite a large audience. We are producing online in that same section of the website, and again we'll send you links and stuff afterwards, a kind of rolling FAQ document, so you can imagine across those 6 events and through our inbox there's been lots of questions, and we're going to come on to questions in a minute. But if you if you think about this today and you reflect and realize you've got a question, it's definitely worth having a look at that as soon as we've published it, because there's a lot of detail in there that breaks down into sort of different categories of interest. And equally, any questions that get covered today will get added to that. So we've kind of got that bank of FAQs for reference. If you want to get in touch with us after today, that's the email address to use. Please use that one. I think it's fair to say that Andrew and I maybe aren't as on top of our inboxes as we might usually be, because we've been gallivanting around the country. But also there's more than just us in the team, and that is monitored, and we want to collate any kind of questions that come through all in one place. Hopefully you won't need to, because we're going to cover it all today. We'll see. So we're going to open to questions in a second, but before I do that, just a couple of words on it. We've obviously got, well, first of all, is the point I've just made. So we are documenting FAQs. They'll be anonymous, but please be mindful that A, that's a resource for you to access online, and B, any questions that come in today will be added to that and put online. We've got an audience online today as well. So what we're going to do in a sec is Andy's going to join me on the stage, and me and him will try and cover all your questions. We've got some roving mics. Carolyn has got those there, and my colleagues here as well. We're going to help with some. When the mic comes to you, please could you wait until you've got the mic, and if you try and keep your questions as brief as you can, and if you wouldn't mind also just introducing yourselves with what's your name and where do you come from before we start the questions, that'd be really useful. So, Caroline, are you okay with the mics there for Q&A? Andrew, do you want to come and join me? We'll start with a question in the room first, and then we'll come to our colleagues online as well shortly. So, hands up, who has a question? Straight over there, back of the room.
D. Jackson, London. The funding for sole use, because
You can make it.
let's make it. Okay. Is the studio for sole use? Because obviously, if you fund a studio in higher education, it can get clogged up with undergrad teaching or masters or whatever. A studio in a commercial entity can get clogged up with commercial requirements. So, is the expectation for sole use?
I think that's a really interesting. Maybe not.
I'll stand here.
I think that's a really interesting question, Lizzie. And I guess, you know, the purpose of the CoSTAR facilities is R&D and innovation. And that can take many forms. I think the one thing, as you spotted, that we were thinking, but not placing it on a university site, is the advice we got from actually largely the academic research community saying, the history of creating facilities in our sector on universities has been they do get clogged up with undergraduate teaching. So therefore we should place it outside. So that was the fundamental thinking. But when by sole use, you can imagine if the objective is R&D, and there's going to be some funds in here to promote access to using those facilities. That's what the demonstrator and pilot funds is. There'll be other projects that come in, there'll be a considerable resource. But should, say, any of these labs have multiple models of how they do that, so some things could come in, they're purely R&D, they're supported from the funds from the labs. Some things could be partnerships with industry, so, you know, developments. Some things I think we could see partner companies, particularly technology companies, having teams that support projects within the lab. So I'm sure that's in some people's minds. And should the facilities occasionally do things that are commercial? I wouldn't say they're necessarily commercial for a whole shoot or something like that, because you then get to the other problem of commercial facilities. But I think there's going to be a mix. So purpose is R&D. Purpose is to underpin future innovation value in the creative sector. But that could happen across a number of different modes. And what I would suggest is that anybody bidding try and describe what they think those modes are and how that might form a kind of operating model.
Great. I'm mindful that we've got a whole audience online. So Sam, have we got any questions come in from our online audience? But we don't have a mic.
You might need to repeat the question.
Okay.
See if this works. Oh boy. So we've got a couple here. There's about 100 people online, so if you want to give them away. We've got a question on co-investment. Is this hard cash or can some of it be in kind? A Laura question.
So just to make sure we heard that, the question was co-investment, is it all hard cash or can it be in kind? Is that right?
Yep.
Okay. Andrew's favourite subject is co-investment, so I'm going to let him do this one.
It'd be lovely if it was hard cash. I can just see those trucks, those armed guards and trucks coming to your building site or your fit out, and that'd be absolutely brilliant. No, it can be a mix of in-kind cash. It could be technology. It could be access to technology. It could be access to other kinds of aspects of the facility. The one thing it should be is countable. And that's why it's my favourite subject. So we've done this in classes and all into the future. We've done a lot of work, and Laura and Hannah were part of this. We've done a lot of work counting co-investment. So what we don't want is fanciful letters of support from companies that you try and quantify and end up with a really big number, and someone sits there and goes, "So I can see they're contributing about 7 people who seem to be costing about £500,000 each." We don't want that. We want something that's practical, and particularly from your core partners. I think one of the things we're not looking for in CoSTAR at this stage, and why we said 5 core partners, is we're not looking for you to lean on SMEs for financial support in the way, in something like the normal, Innovate model. That may have a part in terms of projects, but I think what we need is partners in building an infrastructure rather than in doing so.
Okay, back in the room, Gaynor, question over there.
Oh, hi.
Sorry, Gaynor, if you could use the mic.
Okay. Is that okay? Gaynor from Being Human. We have a space in Newham in E7. And on a question that Andrew asked me, that particular borough, I think, falls between creative enterprise zones, the Thames Gateway, and the Rural Dogs Initiative. Will that negatively impact an application, or is that even more reason to succeed, given it's such a deprived borough? It's very strange with the feedback.
So you're asking, because there's a number of economic support agencies in that area, would that hinder or help an application?
Newham isn't in any of them. Where we sit geographically isn't in any of those specific support areas.
Okay, but it will be in, sorry, I'm trying to remember which one it is. It will be in a LEP and Laura, a mayoral authority. So wherever you are in the UK, you sit in somebody's strategic and economic plan. So it's really about having those conversations, being aware of those plans, those visions, and how your idea for CoSTAR might either deliver those agendas or indeed inform and challenge them so that you can be generating something beyond what they're already thinking of, but working with them to deliver that. So I wouldn't get caught up on very individual specific institutions, but have a look at that bigger regional picture and how you speak to it, because there's no geography in the UK that is immune to that. Anything to add, Andrew, on that? Sorry. Okay, let's get to this side of the room, if we can go in there. Question just here on the second row. Okay.
Thank you. God, Chris Van Ralter from Bournemouth University. Couple of quick questions. One about lot 2. So the co-investment, is that over the 5 years? I mean, as a minimum, is it seen as straight away or over the 5 years, that minimum?
I think it's difficult because everybody's application will be different, everybody's plan will be different, but it has to deliver that vision and support it. So it really depends on how you see that iterating itself across the 5 or 6 years. But yes, think of it in the round as the entire project and how that fits across the network.
Okay, and the other question was, in terms of those 3 labs and that 1 block of funding, is the vision that that's more or less equally divided up between them, or oh dear, is that a bad question?
No, it's a very good question. It's very astute. You spotted that obvious that thing we haven't said. So one might take the view that and we said very strictly up to 3 labs. If you think you can make a case for a bigger network lab or that can deliver across, maybe different geographies, if that's your thing, or to a sector, then make the case. I think we'd probably, the things we looked at in the business case, would probably be quite hard to convince that there should just be only 1 network lab. And obviously over time, we do see this as a network, in an ideal world, one would develop more nodes in it over time. But that's why we said up to 3. We're not saying definitely 3. I think it also helps people not get too much into a kind of putting tanks on people's lawns and a kind of map of the UK. And if they do that, and then we do that, which I think is perhaps not, not time well spent.
Another question from online, Sam?
Yes, we've got a couple. Can I ask you a couple? All right, for the online crew. So we've got Lee Hall from the University of Sunderland. The question about the industrial side of things. They're looking for further guidance on the business model and longer term sustainability, i.e. around running costs. Is there funding / is there an anticipation of commercial revenue through facilities hire, commercial training, etc.?
It's quite a lot in there, isn't it? That's one of those 7 questions that you want. Yeah. So in terms of revenue model and commercialisation, yes, that could be part of the national network or network labs, as long as it's delivering against CoSTAR's overarching objectives and aligns with how you put your proposal together. Sorry, Sam, remind me of part 1.
It was looking at running costs and longer term sustainability.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think the trick here is to think about a longer term operating model. So what is the kind of mixed revenue stream that would make this sustainable? So I think, and then think what CoSTAR is providing, the infrastructure fund is providing the funding for, is establishing and building that and testing it over the first few years. So the exact operating model, CoSTAR won't pay for everything, maybe you build a lab that you think to meet the commitments of the CoSTAR funding needs to provide certain R&D facilities, but maybe it needs something else beyond that you raise from other funds or other partners. We haven't touched on skills, which is interesting because it's been a big thing in most of the thing, is the infrastructure funding can't be used to provide skills programs. That's very precise. We tried this. We went back to base a couple of times in UKRI infrastructure and said, can we do this? They said, no skills. Can we do a pilot? Because you can normally get away with a pilot. You call anything a pilot. And they said, no, you can't have a pilot. Can we provide the spaces, the facilities, the engineers, the technical support staff, and the equipment within which other people could fund skills programs? Yeah, that'd be fine. So skills is perhaps a good example of this. We think there are other partners that aren't R&D infrastructure fund partners that would want to run skills programs in these facilities. But you can only use this funding to create the facilities, not to run the program. So anybody, please, if you think through that and think how it might work and how you might find partners to do that, just don't put a head of skills in, because that's really going to be unhelpful for us. So I think that's relevant to the Sunderland question, is that you can create, this can enable a number of other things without actually funding them directly.
Yeah, so again, it comes back, comes back again to that, really thinking about this as broad in terms of coverage and timelines, and genuinely step change in kind of ecosystem development. So as I said before, not just what the infrastructure is, but what the infrastructure does, and how down the line those kind of opportunities could grow from CoSTAR. Another question in the room. One, Caroline was, oh, there she is. One down here near the front. Oh, okay, we'll go to that one first. Sorry, we'll come next.
Hi, my name is Jeremy Cook. My company's Gameway Europe. I also chair Games Eden, which is a game developer networking group based in Cambridge. I'm interested to know whether you will actually be providing some sort of a matchmaking service, because I'm sure there are people in the room that I'd like to talk to, but I've got no idea who they are. So yeah, coming up with that collaborative group would be quite useful.
Okay, so part of that matchmaking is right here. This is why we didn't do just events on Zoom, and why we've been quite specific about going out into places across the whole UK as well. So hopefully that's a good start. In terms of matchmaking, I think, to be honest, generally speaking, if you're sitting in the room thinking about applying, then the onus is probably primarily on you to have those relationships, to develop them through the course of the funding call, and to have those partnerships at the back of your mind already, perhaps. But we can certainly, through events like this, begin to pull people together. In terms of an actual matchmaking service, is that our job? So we matchmakers, Drew?
I think with this one, I think we've decided that we're probably not matchmakers. So when project-based funding, we've done that before and tried to help partnerships form. We're here for you all to talk to. I think if there are obvious connections that these events haven't made, then we'll try and make those connections, but we're not going to do a kind of online matchmaking service. And I think the reason for that is, I think that this idea of core partners, we're building we're offering funding to build an infrastructure, not to do a series of projects. There will be loads of projects that run through that infrastructure. So actually, this stage is a lot about the core partnerships. So, which are, I think, at the heart of those, you need a relatively small group. And so you've got, I think, yourself to decide, do you want to be a partner in one of these labs for the long term, or do you want to be a user of one of those labs? And they're that different kind of. But I think actually the really helpful thing is you put your hand up and said that, so people go, oh right, okay.
Okay, question down here at the front, and then we'll take another one after that online.
Hi there, I'm Anne, I'm from Blast Theory. We are an artist-led SME, kind of making interactive projects, including kind of interactive film, games and performances. And we have a history of kind of applied research through programs like Horizon and stuff. Slightly related to the last question, it's like, what is your advice for smaller businesses like ourselves in terms of getting involved? We're obviously quite small and the program's very wide, but it's very well aligned with what we do.
Yeah, we've had that similar version of that question come up a lot, and it's great that the small businesses are already engaging. So yes, you're right, there's a lot of alignment with the previous question. I think, and I know you're not the only small business in the room. So I think my initial advice is, again, it's that networking and relationship building. Obviously, for perhaps a smaller or early stage company, that's not always as easy to facilitate as it might be for a more established large business. But I think staying close to your key partners and people that are going in as core partners on the bid and watching how that's going to evolve over time is really important. So I quite like the idea that there's almost already potential spin out activity happening here, not in terms of business creation, I mean in terms of ripple effect. That actually already, you know, there's in the room that have already been to one or two of these briefing events and are starting to build up that network and understand sort of sectors and subsectors that CoSTAR serves. So more of that, but listening to that question and the previous one, one thing we've sort of just touched on, but we're not sure on yet is there will be, I think there is opportunities in the spring and summer for us to do some more outward engagement once things are post-bid phase, and perhaps that's an opportunity for people like yourselves for us to engage in. We can't really promise on that yet because we don't know what's going to happen, but it is food for thought, and we will have a look at what opportunities there are there to bring people back together again and sort of tell a story when we get the other side of the application process.
I think there's another thing that occurs to me, which is Laura showed the assessment criteria. And I think one of the things for, particularly been around the country to a lot of universities, one of the things that they will need to convince the assessors, it's not only us, it's an assessment panel, is that they know not only Partridge that can put these facilities together, but they know how companies are going to use them. What are the use cases for the use of these facilities? So for someone like yourselves, Blast Theory, really well known as kind of innovators in the space, you know, for many years. I would have thought that companies similar to yourselves would be incredibly useful, even if they're not a core partner, for exploring how the facilities are used. So thinking about what would you do with what kind of facility and what kind of project would you run through it? What would it enable you to do that it wouldn't be? That's incredibly useful to anybody putting together a bid, I would say, so that it's not all abstract. But this idea that, yes, you've got the core partners in the infrastructure, but you must know about your users and what they use these things for. So that's what I would say. It leaves you in a beneficial position of not having to fill in the bleeding form, but actually being able to try and just talk to people and say, what about this? What about this? So I think that's what I would do.
I think there's quite a few more questions coming in from online. So Sam, back over to you.
Yeah, we've got a few. We've got, I suspect, some people in the room have similar questions about the facility side of things. So we've got a question from Tom Flynn. How long is the actual build expected to take? How much in the 6 years will it used? And on a similar vein, what about mobile facilities for site-based projects? There's been a shift away from location work and towards 3D scanning in film and TV, but it still requires site work. Can we apply for this stuff to be used off-site? And we've got another one, slightly different one. Are you able to share any information on the lot 3 data inside the site?
Oh, well, the third one's easy. No.
Okay.
And if we were in a position to share it, we would have shared it, but we'll do that separately and soon.
In the year. So on, I think your facilities question, Sam, was firstly, how long are we expecting new builds or refits?
How much of the 6 years is going to be
what building of that 6 years? And then part B to that question was what is our view on mobile facilities so that they're not location based? Is that right?
I think we're not necessarily completely location based.
Okay, so on the duration of the build, it's a really good question. I don't think we're being too prescriptive about that, but obviously it can't be year 6.
So the idea is that this covers a plan, build and test phase. The sooner you get it built, the longer you can use the money to test things, is the idea. And at the moment, all the network labs and the national lab, and when it comes along, lot 3, are all set on the same time scale. And that's all about an overall financial envelope that we've agreed with Bayes and funding. It's simple how it is at the moment. Now, it could be that the different network labs proceed at different rates, depending whether they're fit outs, whether they're, whether they're extension facilities. It could be the national lab decides to get one bit of it up and running first and then other bits. So I think there's going to be quite a lot of you know, there's going to be a lot of detail in that. Somebody's going to have some massive construction delay for, you know, or equipment delay for something we haven't planned for. It's bound to happen. So it's pretty simple at the moment. This money spent over 6 years on that profile, but within that, I think there's going to be lots of, yeah. I think, yeah, flex is probably, we're not getting a lot of flex out of the funding side of things at the moment. There's a kind of use it or lose it, as you can imagine, in the current environment.
On the mobile question, I think at the risk of being a bit of a pain, it depends. If that is serving a really strong vision and there's technology that lends itself to that and there's capability and capacity for that to be delivered, then yeah, I don't think it all has to be entirely location based, but it has to make sense and it has to be that overarching network that Andrew's slide mentioned around serving everybody and being accessible to all. So there's something interesting there to explore with mobile, but it needs to deliver and it needs to hang together. So
I think that's dead right. You'll see if you go on the facts that we've already published. I think we've had a few questions about this, about a network lab. Could it be basically on wheels? Could it move from place to place? You know, I think there are, as Laura says, it depends what the vision is. I think the thing that would be perhaps struggle to convince is if it looks like it's mobile to suit the needs of the partners rather than of industry. So if it was multiple HEIs and suddenly they decided to create a mobile thing so it can move from one HEI to another, that might struggle to convince. I know, Ghislaine, I can see you're smiling at that, but you know there'll be people out there who are going to suggest that.
Any more questions in the room? Okay, one over there. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, James from Copper Candle. My question is about the PI. So are there any minimum qualifications for the PI? Does it have to come from the RTO that's leading the application, or can it be an independent PI?
As probably saw from what Laura went through, we struggle a little bit with JES when you're asking for something so specific. And so it's largely a structure designed for research grants with a principal investigator, and this is a piece of infrastructure. So there are obviously some things that fall out of that. So normally with the PI, the grant's theirs. They could move. This isn't going to work, obviously, in this where you've created a lab and a facility. So there isn't going to be a conventional PI. I think what we've asked, so that's why we've asked all these attachments, because they're not what JES, the inflexible JES are. So we'd like to see your management structure and how you're going to run this thing. As much as possible, tell us about the people who are going to run it, but maybe you don't know. Maybe you actually don't know. If you put in a proposal lab, maybe you want to hire a director for the lab who isn't the PI who's filling in the form at the start of the process. So I'd imagine that the PI would be somebody who works for the lead bidder. But from our point of view, I guess that PI is just the lead contact from the lead partner. It's not necessarily the person who's going to run the whole thing. Certainly they're not going to walk off with it to another institution. And we want to know, including your partners, what your management structure looks like, so that the partners are part of delivering, not just consultative. Does that kind of answer the question?
Any more questions in the room? Can I over there?
Hello, I'm Ghislaine Boddington from Body Data Space and University of Greenwich. So just to say, I'm really happy this is happening, as probably from our long-term work, performance in real time, convergence and telepresence, etc. So I feel very joyful today to see this launching. But I just actually wanted to pin in on that content question, really, to the name of the fund is CoSTAR, Convergent Screen Technologies and Performance in Real Time, which is right up our street. Body Data Space for 30 years been working on this. Is that really going to hold in the content convergence between film, screen and performance in real time? Because I'm asking this because I think that's the most important part of what needs to come, as you do, obviously, but I really also have a kind of instinctive fear these will just end up as film production studios. And how is that being assessed? I guess I'm asking, where's that in the criteria of assessment? She stopped us.
So, let's riff on this a bit and see what we come up with. So, yes, about the convergence. I don't think I have to be, you know, I don't think we are trying to pin down some convergence over experiences. I think what we're saying is that it's an R&D infrastructure that will provide that deals with the convergence around technologies. We think that performance games, film, TV, so screen and performance, are all using these technologies in integrated ways, but the outputs could be different. So I think it's performance is not an add-on to this. If that's what you're looking for, it definitely isn't an add-on to this. So I expect, you know, we've raised, you know, maybe some of the labs are specialized. I wouldn't be surprised to get bids in where they're specialized more at one end of that spectrum perhaps than the other, and around, you know, but the real thing that ties all this together, I think, increasingly is real time. That's what really matters.
Great. Brilliant. Question right over the side, please.
Thank you. I'm from University of the Creative Arts. So my question is to follow up on the matchmaking question. I'm trying to flip it in terms of you as a, you know, the consortiums forms for different reasons, people on the table, people not on the table, accidentally, etc. So for you, let's say, assuming the consortium was announced and there is key partners in it, within this realizing of the value of the money in the region, the economic value, there is key partners that can contribute to these consortiums that warrant for some reason within the discussions, you know, not onto the table at the right time. Is there any, you know, what is your point of view on this, realizing the value after the consortium, let's say, was announced?
That is genuinely really difficult to answer because it completely depends on what the vision and story is that comes through on those proposals through the funded consortium and where they are. But I think we're at risk of repeating the previous answers. Really, is staying close to that, watching how it could develop, and to Blaster's question as well. You know, how could, wherever you sit in that, whether you're from a university or a small business or a large business or a studio, how could you tell the story of CoSTAR? What could you put in and what would you get out of it? And knowing that, and how keeping close to that and looking at that, because the word network is really key, or partnership. So it's not sort of, yeah, it's being quite proactive about what you want and being clear on the mission of how you feel or how you know you could respond to that. What's your role in that? And the only way that can be done is through networks. And hopefully CoSTAR as a programme gives a whole hook to that, because we can, you know, we're coalescing all of those different networks, whether they're the national or the network labs, into one overarching national network. That's the advantage of it. So without a crystal ball, it's really difficult to answer your question. But I think this is where relationships really come into their own, and having that clarity of vision. So actually, in a way, as long as we're all kind of drawn around joint shared purposes, there is that network is something for everyone. That's a little bit of a cheesy ending, isn't it, to that question? Anything else to
Let's just say, and as Laura says, there's a risk of repetition here. What we're asking for at the moment is partnerships to come together to deliver, host and deliver the nodes in this infrastructure. We're not asking for consortia to use the thing. We think that will naturally follow. So you've really got to work out whether you want to or are in a position to contribute to that, you know, the foundation and operation of these labs, or whether actually the value add is you want the labs to exist and you want to use them. Because we don't, so that's why I would say one of the things we're saying about maximum 5 core partners, we only want the partnerships to operate these things to be as large as they need to be and no larger.
I'm mindful of time. We've got time for a few more questions, but we've got a lot from our online audience. So let's go back over to Sam. So that we're not
being able to put it in writing, that really helps.
To how many questions they can ask. So I'm going to try and ram a few together here. So can you give guidance on the relationship between the National Lab Pilot Demonstrator Programme and how that will work with the network labs? Can you say something about international partners and if there's any guidance about how that relates to the UK agenda? And we've got a question saying that the guidance says that you're limited to 5 core partners. Could one of those partners be a consortium itself, i.e. 5 universities collaborating as one?
Does it sound like that, what we're asking for? That's what I'd ask.
Okay. And the last one of this strand is, can you talk a bit about your expectations around diversity targets?
Okay, so the first thing to say about all, I think there were 4 questions, let's say there were 4 questions there, is they have all been asked before, I think, all of them have.
So we can quickly,
Shouldn't we just, yes, let's try and do that. Which one do you want to do first?
diversity targets, because I can remember it, because I'm about getting old, it's the last one. So what we're asking for is really clear, and it's based on one particular thing that worked really fantastically in the clusters. Which was one program where people set their own targets, and they were very stretching. As a Story Futures Academy, and fair play to them. They set gender participation and ethnic diversity participation targets, which look way stretching, and they then achieved them. So we're asking you to adopt the same thing. We do not want your EDI policy. We want to know what targets you're going to set for EDI participation and what difference you're going to make, if I can put it like that. Do you think that, hopefully that helps with that one?
Yeah. On the 5 core partners, 5 core partners are 5 core partners, not 4 core partners and then 5 rounds together.
50 people.
Yeah, so hopefully that was clear. I don't think, again, I forgot.
The relationship between the network, the national lab and the network.
Okay, well.
And particularly around the pilots and demonstrators program, yeah?
Yeah.
So the pilots and demonstrator program is I'm trying to remember the figures, £9 million fund. It will be managed on behalf of the whole network by a team at the national lab. But all of the labs will benefit. So this is the idea of that management structure where all labs get together and go, how does that actually work? But we imagine that funding for those pilots and demonstrators will flow across the whole system and be available to all the labs. It will just be managed and operated by a team at the national lab.
Right, we have one time for one more question in the room. Right, probably best not for me to finish things by falling over. Who's got the mic? I can't even.
It's Madalena. Quick question. For the development of the full business case, kind of what's the difference between the initial application that's going in for February and what's the expected development to submit onwards to the government in terms of effort?
In terms of
effort, like, you know, how big does it get and how much justification? Is it the whole track?
Good question.
So this is the FBC process.
Yeah, what's the expectations of full business case development in the spring?
Right.
How much detail will that require?
So this is a bit of a new one. That FBC process is a bit of a new one, both for the infrastructure fund and specifically for AHRC. So we've been a little bit cautious, assuming. But the purpose of the FBC is basically to replace the outline business case with what we're actually going to do. So there'll be some, you know, how to make sure it still fulfills all the criteria and all those kind of things, but actually defining what we're actually going to do. So you can set up the measurements against what we're actually going to do rather than this theoretical thing. So there's definitely going to be involvement of the preferred bidders in that period. We've allowed quite a long period because we've allowed the maximum time that it can take. But I think importantly, something else can go on there, which is a lot of projects suffer from grant funding projects suffer from wheel spin at the start. So what I think we'd anticipate doing is when you've got preferred bidders, yes, one part of it's what's the full business case, and team at AHRC will submit that, but it will involve the plan. But the other is, whilst we can't, in that period, whilst we can't get the grant started, is we should do a lot of planning and coordination, sort out how things are going to work, sort out how that management structure is going to work, sort out what by that stage can and cannot be afforded. Let's be realistic about this. You know, this is almost a year from now that we're actually doing Project Start, and I don't hear any, oh, it's fine, it'll be indexed by inflation, money is just, you know. So let's sort all that out so that by the earliest that the grants can start, the money can start to flow, everybody knows what they're doing and they're all well prepared.
Yeah. Okay, I'm aware that there might be a lot more questions in the room, but we're all indeed on Zoom. But we are running out of time.
The good thing on Zoom, of course, is that we can answer those questions because people have written them down.
Yes, and I will say again that FAQ, rolling FAQs, we will tweet and share through email when that's live, and that will just keep getting updated as we filter through the questions that come through each chat.
Welcome back. And so I've got this great panel. I've got Rishi Coupland from the BFI. I've got Sue Lister from ILM London, the executive in charge. And Jeremy Silver, obviously CEO of Digital Catapult. So all of these people know, in some ways, more about what CoSTAR could be than we do in terms of being the funder who's trying to design the opportunity. So I'm gonna Jeremy, it's only right and proper that I start with you. Not really. Two things really. Given the acceleration over the last 3-4 years, indeed since we first spoke about something like this, do you think it's as important now and as relevant as it was then? And also, how important do you think it is to create something that's national?
Great question. So I think the speed of adoption of the sort of, you know, the broadest version of digital production, virtual production, whatever you want to call it, is patchy, and it's not uniform across the whole industry. And you know, there are those who would say it's about 10% at the moment of the major film productions that actually use this kind of technology. I think it's actually quite hard to say in reality, because you know, there are all kinds of different sorts of things, but we've still got loads to do. The technology is still developing like crazy. Every single one of the setups that is currently used, and you know, Stu can talk far more about this than I can, is bespoke. You know, the concepts of best practice don't exist. The gaps that are there between what the vendor's individual offerings are and how to plug it all together, not filled. So there's lots to do, and there's all sorts of areas of pushing the boundaries in all of this. And you know, I'm sure that lots of you have been reading with lots of interest about AI and playing with Mid-Journey and other devices like that that can create content in automated ways, which raise all sorts of interesting questions and present us with versions of what the future might look like. So I think this is a global opportunity, not just a national opportunity. And it's the reason it's so important is because we have a position as the UK of some expertise and some reputation, and we need to keep that up. We don't need to lose it. And the best way of keeping it up, best form of defense, is attack. And so that's why we should do this, and why it should be national. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I'm just thinking about the national bit of it. If you flesh that out a bit more, because obviously we're thinking about, you know, we've set this up to fund multiple nodes. I mean, the idea of that is obviously to create some kind of national network. I can imagine we add nodes to it later on as well. But I'm just wondering how important you think that is. Obviously, you know, when you're talking about the kind of things that Sue and ILM are doing, many ways, you know, you've got a national network, but a lot of stuff happens around the M25. So how important do you think we should be thinking about in terms of the UK distribution of this, rather than just where industry is?
So your fabulous clusters program illustrates the fact that, you know, there is talent and expertise all over the country. The UK's film industry is very tied to the southeast. So obviously there are some exceptions, but broadly speaking, and so there is an opportunity to do something about that, which I think would be a good thing. But also, in a sense, you know, if you look around the country, if you look at almost every local authority or combined authority's industrial strategy, if you read them all, they will all tell you that they are specialists with an enormous amount of talent in the creative industries. And it's remarkable. We are apparently in every single region of the country, creative industries is there. Well, actually, if you look at the numbers and you look at the distribution of where creative companies are, there's this, you know, there's some justification for saying that.
Some, yeah.
So the question, I think, is what do you do with that? How do you make that meaningful? How do you take advantage of what's special in one place and not in another? Is there a common underlying level of expertise that we could expect to see, or professionalism that we could expect to see across the country as a whole? And then are there areas where we might develop particular expertises? I mean, our work at Digital Catapult has kind of taken us regionally from the beginning, and we're setting up. We have a virtual production studio in Gateshead, which is about to go live, and another one which will be live in the new year here in London, which previously was in Guildford. And so we've been playing with what that feels like and what that looks like. And although those studios are not necessarily the same as what I envisaged in CoSTAR, I think that, you know, our experience of doing that has led us to feel, you know, really excited about what this opportunity represents, regardless of who ends up running whatever facilities, because of, you know, that we can see that there's value there. And the other bit of it, just to finish, is that although we're not talking about skills and training, the reality is we all know is there's a massive talent and skills gap, and the industry is absolutely desperately crying out for people with expertise in this. So although CoSTAR itself is not a skills program, it will enable the capability of developing that and hopefully accelerating that process. So I think that's another reason why it's so important, and to do that nationally.
Okay, cool, thank you. And we'll probably come back to skills, because actually it's an interest. I've heard Sue talk about this very eloquently. It's an interest of the BFI, so perhaps we'll come back to that. Right, so I take it, you know, brilliantly that you're interested in this. You know, you're on this panel. We talked about you talked about this before, but from the point of view of ILM, you've got this fabulous pipeline of projects which you probably can't talk about. You've got an amazing R&D team. You've got facilities, you know, through other parts of the organization in the UK that are right at the forefront. Why would you actually need CoSTAR? What can it do for you?
Good question. I think that, well, first of all, I think that maybe there's an overestimation of some of our R&D team. I would sum it up by saying that I think our R&D teams locally and globally are very much focused on today's and tomorrow's, like literally tomorrow's problems. I think what piques my interest about CoSTAR is sort of next week's problems, next month's problems, next year's problems. And I think that what you always get out of collaboration with universities, education, research institutions is they're slightly in a different quadrant to you. They're, you know, knowledge quadrant. You know, we tend to operate in, you know, we know what we know, and we know what we don't know. And project by project, we will probably move between those two. But I think universities are often operating in the, well, we don't know what we don't know, and that's what interests me. I sound like a monster.
It's not a comparison I'd ever thought we'd make.
But that's what interests me about it, is that this is such a vast, you know, I mean, you know, Jeremy, you and I talked about it earlier, Andrew as well, you know, what this is, I think, the real question, you know. And actually, if you asked me last year what I think virtual production was, I would give one answer, and I might give a different answer now. It's incredibly fascinating, and I think the exciting thing is, and maybe this partly answers the question you asked Jeremy, is that I think it's so interesting when you see it in the hands of other people. You know, what ILM and our clients choose to do with virtual production technologies. And it's just a tool set. It's a tool set that we stack together in various different ways to solve different problems. you know, I noticed in the paperwork that you put out, actually you mentioned two of our projects. One was ABBA and the other one was The Mandalorian. Both could be considered to be using virtual production, and they did, but they use different parts of the tool set in entirely different ways.
Yeah.
And that is, I think, what's very interesting. It's just a tool set, and I've heard a lot of people here to the democratization and the national aspect of it. That, I think, is what's exciting. If you create these labs, SMEs, people who've got great ideas can start to understand what that tool set does for them and go, oh, okay, if I turn it upside down and back to front and speak German to it, it might do this. And that's really interesting. That's where the creativity lies.
Okay, I think that actually brings us that's a very neat segue onto what might be the BFI's thoughts about this, because you published, you know, 10 year, with 3 years of detail and 7 years of, you know, strategic plan. And some of those issues like spreading access to this, but encouraging different users within the, particularly obviously the film or screen community. So how do you think, Rishi, that CoSTAR could help that strategy that the BFI have set out? You know, which bits are relevant to it, which bits could play through it?
I think it's worth acknowledging, as much as we look forward, to just have a quick look at the last few years we've had, and to just, I think, know just what an extraordinarily successful time I think it has been for innovation. And, you know, we could have just been watching the first few minutes of an amazing firework display, and then we realized that actually someone set up all the fireworks off at once and that's it, it's all over. But I don't think so. I think we've seen, you know, every time I've been asked to make predictions, or the BFI can ask to make predictions about growth in the sector, you know, it's been beaten. We've seen, it turns out I'm sat next to an incredible driver of innovation that have a voyage, the Mandalorian. We've seen pre-visualization and convergence of technology already. But the reason I think that that's the beginning of going somewhere very exciting, and not, well, it's the S curve of innovation and we're going to tail off now, is because what's been absolutely central in driving that innovation is, I think, the pairing of fast growth of technology, ability to test and deliver to a very willing market, and audiences who've embraced and really grabbed it. You know, I've seen a presentation around story futures recently, which was, you know, story futures could have been a very successful, let's just run it up the flagpole and see how it flutters. And in fact, audiences have loved it, and it feels closer to a finished product, as close to a finished product that can be rolled out to tomorrow as it does to something that's sort of early stage innovation, which it is as well. So we're seeing the ability to take ideas which are feasible, then viable, and then long-term sustainable very quickly. And that's a very unique part of an innovation cycle. Jumping to 10 years and spreading it out, if we know that we have this ability to get technology in front of audiences and to leverage actually regional centers of excellence as well, it still needs something like CoSTAR, I think, to bring it together. That's what's really exciting, because we're interested in BFI about how independent filmmakers and screen creators can access this technology as well. There's no reason for them to lag, other than, I think, access to infrastructure. So I think that we'll be very interested in how this reaches down the kind of value chain. We're incredibly interested in diversity, and you talked about the UK needs to seize the opportunity. Well, the UK has an inbuilt advantage, I think, in diversity, I would say, in that, you know, I've recently met with European film agencies, and they're very envious of our successes in diversity. So I think it's a mixture of right here, right now, feels very good. You know, BFI, our mission is society needs stories, and we want to see that spread through society. So we're very pleased with the approach to CoSTAR, which we think will lend itself to that, national, but then regional as well, and openness to SMEs. So we think it's exactly the right time to be launching an initiative like this.
Cool. That's really helpful. And I think actually we had a conversation not that long ago about the perception of the UK as a filmmaking culture, which I think there was some real insight from that on how, say, making this stuff accessible to independent film might change the type of films that are created.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, we did some exploratory research in 15 international territories saying, well, we're British, we think we know what being British is, but let's take an exterior view. And actually there was very strong receptiveness, and Yonder, who carried out that research, estimated there's a latent market of 290 million people worldwide who already feel they know what British content is, would love to see more of it, and are excited by innovation. So innovation actually is somewhere where we can fill the gap a bit more. As it regards independent filmmakers, look, audiences love to world building. You know, we've seen that, and we see that in the change, natural change in some of the types of screen content which is available. And, you know, this has been coming for a while. You know, Gareth Edwards is an independent filmmaker who made Monsters and blew everyone's minds because he had that kind of knowledge of how to make visual effects match a creative vision, and we can build on that. So I think that we want to not be hidebound by the success of British content, and you know, not to pinch a stereotype, but say it's all about period dramas and the past, but actually, you know, seize upon a new generation of creators coming through who've got bigger visions and the technology to achieve those.
Yeah, no, that's really, really interesting. And just as an aside, I hired Gareth when he was 21, and I said, what do you want to do? Actually, we're just hiring for a multimedia production company. And he said, one day I'm going to make a film on this computer. I'm going to make the entire thing. I'm going to do all the CGI. I'm going to direct it, everything. And I thought he was mad at the time, but turned out he was right, you know, and mastered all of those techniques. I just want to turn to this thing. So one of the things we've said and we've had lots of questions about it, is this idea of having a national lab that works at like tomorrow's problems, and then these network labs that work closest to those solutions. And I think, so I think you just described them as next week's problems. You know, it's kind of, I think we thought we had a couple of years in it, but I just want to get a sense of, particularly from yourself and Jeremy, that whether that makes sense to you. And Jeremy, you mentioned in your introduction Creative XR, and I remember a conversation that we had where we were trying to decide on these TRL levels where Creative XR sat, because in some ways they were like lunatic prototypes of things that might exist, and in other stages they were R&D for shows that indeed have existed and have won awards more recently. So how do you think that works? How do we get that right? The ability to encourage people to operate over the horizon and with today's problems.
Well, I think the thing is that, you know, from an industry point of view, the problems are always today's problems, and the challenge the industry has is it doesn't do any R&D really, right? There's very little. What goes on is, you know, the R&D that happens is either in any one production in order to solve a problem for that production, right? Most of the time, because that's where the budget is. And so that's why this, I think, lab opportunity is so important. But I think in terms of what it might really contribute and how it's going to address that, to some extent that will be about responding to demand. And I think one of the things that's happened in the period since we first started talking about this, which was, you know, over 3 years ago now, and where we are now, is that we're facing a lot less of an optimistic economic prospect. Yeah. And therefore, you know, the chances of seeing in the industry investing more in leading edge things, I think, is probably reducing. The number of, you know, remakes, brand extensions, you know, that we're seeing is increasing, and that is to do with the conservatism in the belief of what's popular and what will sell. And in faced with economic headwinds and a recession and layoffs, and, you know, we've seen some of that in the technology sector already, and we've seen a little bit of it in the film space. Games so far seems to have been reasonably immune to that, but, you know, the the playing out of multiple players in the video streaming market. You know, we've seen what that's done to Netflix's share price, and so the reason I'm mentioning all of that is because clearly what becomes important to the industry and what the priorities are in a context like that are a little bit different from the more expansive mood that we might have been in 2 or 3 years ago, when all that investment that has gone into new studios in the UK, particularly from the US, was being planned and put into place. So I think, you know, it is a sobering moment to think about that and to think about, well, what does that mean? And I suppose, you know, the key thing that it will do is that if you take the sort of the economic headwinds and you take the climate emergency as the two things that are driving our imperatives more, you know, from every point of view, whether it's, you know, commercially or from the consumer's perspective, then I think that will tell you something about the kinds of areas in which we're likely to see innovation being more driven into, and that might switch the balance a little bit. You know, that in a way, you know, 2 or 3 years ago, we were thinking very optimistically about extraordinary creative opportunities. And I'm not saying I don't think there are those, because there are extraordinary creative opportunities. But I think we also need to temper that with, well, what's the reality of what's going on in the world, and what do we need to do in order to protect that? And in a sense, the opportunity to make the industry more efficient, I suppose, is part of what will drive that.
Yeah, so wise words as ever, but quite a challenge for the conventional move into a downturn is, whilst yes, the near market systems can earn their crust, you know, you can see the business case for doing all those, that the earlier stage R&D is often the things that certainly businesses find the hardest to justify moving into a downturn. So does that mean we need to make sure that CoSTAR, the public funding of CoSTAR, picks that up? Because Sue, you can obviously see something useful that this does for you, but it'll be even more useful if it pays for itself, won't it?
Yeah. I'm not sure if this is working. Yeah, that was an open question. I didn't quite know how.
Well, I suppose what does that tell us? What should we be prepared for? I mean, one of the things I've been keen that we prepare our funders for is there's going to be some bad news stories along the way. I don't think they've listened to that yet. Because we sold it to them. You know, these things take years to sell. But one of the things we've also kind of see this as is an industry R&D partnership. How are we going to, what do we need to do to maintain the interest of ILM in a position where that, you know, today's problems will be today's problems and be ever more important as things get tougher in the market?
I think, I don't know if this answers your question. I think that the interesting thing for the problems that we solve are not our problems, they are our clients' problems. And I think that, you know, to use somebody like Gareth Edwards, who is a client of ours, you know, people like Gareth will bring us a problem and say, here you go, ILM, can you solve it? And, you know, to what Jeremy said, actually, on any given project, actually, it isn't really R&D necessarily. Once we're on a project, timescales are really limited, and you are, you know, just gluing everything together with sticky tape and chewing gum and hoping that it works, and what falls out of it may be reusable for the future, or you may just bin it and start again, and that is the nature of production. But I think that you know, there is incredible talent in this country, both within production, within the university sectors, that actually, that it's that collaboration, I think, that keeps you interested, which is, and I think also those challenges to what problems are we going to solve, they don't only come from, you know, big film directors, they can come from small museums, they can come from all sorts of places. And I think, so there is, you know, in terms of it paying for itself,
these are technologies that have enormous application, enormous growth opportunities. Starting to sound like Liz Truss now.
Liz Truss and Donald Rumsfeld. You can go down the whole spectrum of the
I'm covering the
right
whole
of politics.
political
Brilliant.
spectrum here. Mainly on the right wing thing. Anyway, but I think that's where it starts to pay for itself.
Okay, so that's a really, really good message, I think, about challenge setting, is how we use this community to set the right challenges and ask interesting questions and with different timescales and different applications.
Yeah, I think rarely is technology an answer unto itself, and you know what visual effects, my bread and butter is creativity with usually a technology solution, but you need the problem to solve in the first place. That's the exciting bit.
It does make, it's funny, no one's commenting on this, but it does make the director of research of these labs sound like incredibly cool jobs, doesn't it? Really, really, really interesting trying to set those kind of challenges. Okay, we're keeping these people away from lunch, but I want to tap into your kind of insights of, if there's one thing that you wanted this thing to do, what would it be?
Well, I think the most exciting thing is the numbers of companies with new solutions that, if we get this right, will be created out of this, right? If you think about where we are with our friends at the game engines will tell you that they have solved all the problems and that all you need to do is plug the game engine in and everything happens, and everybody knows that's not true. So once you start with that premise, then what are all the things that you also need to do? What are the other tools that you need? What are the other software solutions that we need? And we're really good in the UK at producing very specialized, smart businesses that come up with ingenious solutions and productize those and get those out. And I'd love to see loads more of those.
So new businesses, a whole new tier of new products. Great, that's really clear. Who'd like to go next?
Go on then. I think, can I say two things? Go on, I can. I've got the mic.
Pretend they're one thing.
Well, one thing which splits into two. I think that there's a salience and a search problem sometimes with innovation. There is, to a certain extent, I think CoSTAR is a bet on the talent in the UK, the talent in the research sector, the talent of SMEs. I would back that bet. I think that so if it can unearth talent and then actually make that something that's can be plugged into, and the way that people can plug into it can be very varied. We, as you said, industry sometimes doesn't really have the market set up or the financial setup to think long term. But BFI's just done a deal with Netflix to do with archiving content from streamers. That is Netflix thinking long term. It's the way you do it. So to be that nexus, that catalyst, that crossing point where talent's unearthed, but then and that's where the demonstrators come in, would be really key. And the second thing would be, if there is, because you talked about the horizon not being blue skies, and I think if there's a possibility to get ideas tested and to use that as the proving point, we're in the age of the pivot, aren't we, still for technology, and to allow for pivoting, I think that's something that will mean that we drop out of the hype cycle and into the real world. So I think those are the two things that I think would make me even more excited about CoSTAR.
Great, fantastic. Sue, you have potentially the final word.
Exciting.
Which politician are you going to do this time?
I'm trying to think. I think I'm going to go for two things, and they're not related. I think one of them, I like the national reach of the funding. I think that's really important. Anything that is spreading technology skills. I know that it's not necessarily tangentially about skills, but outside of the Southeast, particularly in film, actually is really exciting. I would also say, I think that you know, there's a lot of talk about metaverse and virtual production, but actually I think the area that I see being most exciting is the sort of convergence of a lot of the creative industries coming together on projects. And those are the projects increasingly that I get quite excited about, where you're bringing different, potentially people who've never thought of working together before, different worlds together. That's often where this technology is enabling, from what I'm seeing.
Fantastic. So that's a brilliant example of why I have these kind of panels, because we boringly brief people on what we think. And now Jeremy wants us to bet on companies, new companies. Rishi wants us to bet on talent, and you want us to bet on convergence. And that sounds like a real good definition of where we should be aiming. So what a brilliant panel. Thank you very much.